very much. Well, thank you very much, Anders. And ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm sure it'll be very boring, but... Right, so I'm going to talk about really the necessity of classicism, how rich and varied it is, but how adaptable it is. It is, of course, a language, but a few definitions I think would be very useful. What does the term classical actually mean? It means something of the first rank, the highest class, order, authority, or importance. It's a standard, it's a model, it's exemplary. The classical ideal is really characterized by clarity, completeness, symmetry, deceptive simplicity, repose, and harmonious proportions, often associated with music. It's associated too with civilized life, with perfection, taste, and serenity. The classical language of architecture is not a free-for-all in which elements are arbitrarily thrown together. It's a highly sophisticated system, and its traces survived throughout the centuries. Classical architecture is permeated with elements that can be related directly to the architectural vocabulary and language of Greco-Roman antiquity, or are derived as variants of such vocabulary and language. And what of language? Language, in a generalized sense, consists of words and methods of combining them in the expression of thought. And it can also be the phraseology or terms of a science, an art, a specialism, and so on, including classical architecture. It has meaning. And so classical, signifying the conforming to rules and models of Greek and Latin antiquity, when applied to language and architecture, suggests something coherent, something not meaningless, with all sorts of allusions capable of enormous ranges of expression, like the spoken language of a culture. True architecture can engage the mind as well as shelter the body. But when the base, shaft, capital, entablature sequence that comprises an order of architecture, when that's considered, obviously it's not merely a decorative element applied to a building for aesthetic reasons, it's actually a satisfying expression of structure and stability. This is important psychologically as well as physically to those who look at it. It may appear extremely robust and powerful, or it may be elegant and highly decorative and festive. It can be fun. Yet in all its guises, it usually looks stable. It looks as though it won't fall down. It induces, therefore, confidence in the people who look at it and expresses and even emphasizes the essence of the structure. And looking back over 2 millennia, it's clear that language has enabled the creation of great buildings and even whole harmonious blocks in cities, because it's infinitely adaptable. It enables rich invention and infinite numbers of variations on its basic themes to blossom. Modernism has discarded a great language. A mighty and expressive vocabulary has been thrown out of the window. A whole system of grammar and syntax in favor of a series of monosyllabic grunts, with the predictable making of a ghastly dystopia of uninhabitable cities, incessant noise, and violent pornographic entertainment. So without an alphabet, only a few images of approved exemplars, a vocabulary, without a language, modernism can only represent itself. Can you imagine other professions, say medicine or the sciences, chucking away millennia of knowledge? Would you be happy to be surgically operated on by someone who knew nothing of the wisdom about the human body gained through empirical experiment and scientific investigation over the centuries, and who insisted your condition could be cured by quoting Derrida or the rantings of Le Corbusier? Now, the point about this is that modernism has created chaos where before there was order. The classical architect created order out of chaos. There is therefore a system connected with the great religions of the world. This is a design by Carl Friedrich Schinkel for a royal palace on the Athenian Acropolis. He is merging new buildings and keeping the best of antiquity that is there. There is serenity, there is control, there is color, there's everything there. That was 1830s. Another great German architect, Leo von Klenze, designed this building, which is the Ruhmeshalle in Munich. It is interesting because it is in the form of the great altar of Pergamon, which hadn't been discovered when von Klenze designed this. So you have the two projected temple fronts on either side of a long stoa with a massive statue of Bavaria by Schwanthaler in the center. This was a series of marvelous neoclassical buildings which had been designed for King Ludwig I of Bavaria, who was a Hellenophile. Von Klenze also designed this great gateway to the Königsplatz in Munich, where he has a Doric temple front between two pylons. And I'd like you to particularly look at the square columns in the flanking pylons at the tops of the pylons. There is a connection with Bavaria too, because Prince Otto of Bavaria was elected king of Greece when Greece became independent of the Ottoman Empire. So a German prince, Greece, encouraged this connection between the two. So where does that square column come from? Well, in the middle of the 18th century, the Society of Dilettanti in London financed an expedition to Greece to measure and draw Greek buildings from antiquity. It was a dangerous operation because the country was infested with bandits. The measuring and the drawing had to be done under armed guard, and the books were published. Sorry, I don't know what's happened there. The books were published. I think that I've touched that. That shouldn't have happened. I beg your pardon. One of the buildings they measured and drew was the Koragic monument of Thrasyllus, which is built into a cave on the cliffs in Athens. It's a very interesting building because it has a square column between two antae. It has a continuous row of guttae, which you can see, and wreaths on the frieze. Now, Greek temples we look at, and we don't associate them with windows. So when Greek revival architecture really started to take off in the latter part of the 18th century and mostly in the early part of the 19th century, this was a very useful trigger for the design of openings. mixed with another expedition, this time French, to Egypt, which involved the measuring and drawing of ancient Egyptian temples. So we have the continuous row of square columns. So by a process of syncretism, architects adapted the choragic monument and began to do strange things with it. For example, the French, Durand and Thibault, produced this temple at the time of the revolution, the early revolutionary building, with square columns, human heads as the capitals, and otherwise it's really a Greek temple. But when we take this work by the great Carl Friedrich Schinkel, we see how the Egyptian square column temple mixed with Thrasyllus has produced a solution to openings in the great Schauspielhaus in Berlin. A really marvelous solution to the problems of creating windows in a great temple-like building. This is an old photograph I found. It's a postcard I have in my collection showing that marvelous building with one of Gontard's marvelous cupolas in the Gendarmenplatz in Berlin, probably one of the finest urban spaces in Europe, I think, of the time. And if we, oh, what's happened? There we are. If we go to Glasgow, Alexander Greek Thompson takes the same theme and uses it in the wall in Murray Place in Glasgow, which is a row of terrace houses. You'll notice the two projecting temple fronts, this time with square columns, and the long row between. So it's we know that Thompson had a copy of Schinkel's published drawings in his office in Glasgow, and he uses the same theme at Walmer Crescent, which you see on the right, and I'm afraid I'm sort of halfway in the way. You can see the square columns, the Thrasyllus order used in this wonderful synthesis of themes from antiquity. And in Hampshire, William Wilkins, who was one of the leading figures of the Greek revival in England, produced this wonderful country house with its magnificent Greek Doric portico, and notice the Thrasyllus order again on the left. But this time used instead of a full-sized order, and the Thrasyllus order again for the pilasters. But if you look at the attic story of this building above the main entablature, you'll see that it comes straight from Stewart and Revitt's survey drawing of the choragic monument of Thrasyllus. Thrasyllus appears yet again at Charlottenhof in Potsdam, a delightful villa by Schinkel for the then Crown Prince of Prussia, Friedrich Wilhelm, who became Friedrich Wilhelm IV. And we're entering here into the Night Kingdom, where there's running water and hippocamps to entertain us before we go up into the light of the rooms above. But here you have Thrasyllus just quoted, straight from Stewart and Revitt's great survey. Square columns appear again in the works of Claude Nicolas Ledoux, in one of the barrières in Paris, the toll houses erected under the Ancien Régime. But you will notice that there are one or two interesting things about this. We have a drum with a Doric entablature. Notice the triglyphs. We have a series of overlapping Serlianas, but this time they're Greek Doric Serlianas, not Renaissance Ionic or anything like that. And they're baseless Greek Ionic columns without flutes. And we have square columns, square Doric, for the main portico. So here we have an architect of genius synthesizing, drawing together elements from the Renaissance, from ancient Greece, from Thrasyllus, from Greek temples, and in fact a Roman tomb, the tomb of Cecilia Metella or the Via Appia Antica, for example, suggests the drum with the Doric entablature. And even in industrial buildings, Jesse Hartley in Liverpool used baseless Greek Doric for these warehouses. They're made of cast iron, incidentally, and they carry the enormous weight of brickwork above. Cast iron is very strong in compression and hopeless in tension because it fractures. But these must be amongst the most reduced elemental examples of Classicism using the Greek orders. Now, Stuart and Revett also produced a measured drawing of the so-called Tower of the Winds in Athens, which you see on the left. It was a building that was very influential. It has a version of the Corinthian order, and you'll notice that Corinthian order in Greece had no base. The capital consists of palm leaves above acanthus leaves. So it's not a normal Corinthian capital at all. But it was also used by James Stewart, known as James Athenian Stewart, for his work in Greece, in this delightful little belvedere in County Down from the 1780s, straight from the Tower of Winds, a most exquisite little building with the most marvelous inlaid floors with patterns and so on and so forth. And you can see the palm capital used quite clearly on that. And James Wyatt, designed the Radcliffe Observatory at Oxford, taking the Tower of the Winds, which you see virtually quoted up above, mixed with other elements such as attenuated ionic pilasters to create this really marvelously elegant building, the observatory. And when it came to churches, well, Greek temples didn't have spires, so in order to provide one, the inwards, WH and W inward, used the Ionic order from the Erectaion in Athens for the main portico. It's an Ionic order with a kind of a frieze around the top of the column, just immediately underneath the volutes. And then he quotes the Tower of the Winds and adapts it to form this very elegant octagonal element which forms the spire. Stuart and Revett also, I don't know what's happened to this, is it? Here we are. They also measured building the Temple of Apollo at Delos, which, as you see, has a rather curious order. The flutes occur at the top and the bottom of the shafts. And notice that Greek Doric had no base. This was seen as a specific order, but in fact it's not a distinct order. It was thought of at the end of the 18th century, at the beginning of the 19th, as a distinct order, but in fact this is how the Greeks left some of their columns to be fluted later. The flutes at the top and the bottom were used as guidelines, and then the shafts were carved in situ. But this was interpreted as a distinct order, and sometimes appears as such. In this amazing Greek temple in County Down in Ireland, it's a Greek temple using the order from the Temple of Delos as published by Stuart and Revett, and you'll notice the simplified entablature. The triglyphs don't have any glyphs. In other words, the indentations are not there, and the little pegs, the guttae, underneath the triglyphs have been converted into a kind of abstraction of guttae. Another building that was measured and drawn and was widely adaptable was the choragic monument of Lysicrates, and that's Stewart and Revitt's survey drawing as engraved on the left. A very elegant Corinthian order, very much taller and more elegant than the Roman version, and there's a band underneath which we think was probably a bronze, maybe gilt band, placed between those leaves at the top of the column, just immediately beneath the capital. They also showed the whole thing with the elaborate top, and when Stewart was hired to design the garden buildings at Shugborough in Staffordshire, here it is, the choragic monument of Lysicrates as a garden ornament, an eye-catcher in an English country park of a great house, Shugborough. Very accurately done, even to the tripod on top, which was awarded to the victor of the choragic monument. And that particular order of Greek Corinthian appears in a hotel in Stamford in Lincolnshire, which you see on the left, by a man called J.L. Bond. And it's one of, I don't think he did all that many things, but he did this quite correct, academically correct Greek Corinthian order, which is used again at this funerary monument in Ripon Cathedral in Yorkshire. It's sort of half the monument, but instead of being circular, it's been turned into a sort of half ellipse. And it shelters a bust of the William Weddell, who owned Newby Hall, for whom Robert Adam designed a series of very splendid neoclassical rooms to house Weddell's collection of antique sculpture, which he'd collected on his grand tour of Europe in the 18th century. And that monument again appears at the Great Curiosity, the Große Neugierde, at Schloss Glienicke near Berlin, designed by Schinkel. And you see, there's the choragic monument of Lysicrates at the top, and a variation of the Greek Corinthian order as the colonnade around the drum below. A most wonderful amalgam of elements from antiquity in this very beautiful building. Now I'm going to return to Schinkel again, because he was also responsible for this great building, if I can get it to work. No. I don't know what's happened. It doesn't seem to work.
Is it locked?
It's not working.
It's not working.
Maybe if I worked from here, which is this it? Yeah.
Yes.
No. No, back one.
No, it works. So no, it works.
Right. Schinkel's great museum, now known as the Altes Museum in Berlin, the 1820s, built for King Frederick William III of Prussia. It's a great Ionic stoa held between antae. So you've got the antae at either end, a splendid entablature above with the usual layers of the architrave and the frieze and the cornice. And the central feature rises up behind it, contains a rotunda within the square. But this marvelous piece of Greek Ionic, almost a stoa-like form with the erection capitals, is best seen from within. And here is a wonderful view over to the Schloss, which you see on the left, the Friedrich-Werdersche Kirche, which you see straight through the columns, the order from the Erection in Athens, available from Stewart and Revitt's careful surveys, and this splendid formal staircase rising up to the rooms for this great collection, which the king intended to raise the tone of society generally. Rather like these chaps striking neoclassical attitudes as they wander around. And here is the building today, photographed by Martin Charles from a ladder, and myself with David Watkin, not striking neoclassical attitudes. We established that Schinkel must have used a camera obscura for that drawing he published in his Sammlung. So here is the adaptability of classicism. Now, one of the techniques that modernists have used is to try and persuade us that there's some sort of connection with respectable architects of the past. For example, Wilson and Womersley called these crescents, which were built in the 1970s and have since been demolished because they leaked, fell down, and didn't work. They were called Adam, after it was Adam Crescent, Barry Crescent, Kent Crescent, and Nash Crescent. Now, isn't that shameful to name them after distinguished great architects who did wonderful things? But it's an old technique, and one that's used again and again, like trying to persuade us that the arts and crafts people were pioneers of the modern movement. Today, there are some brave people doing good work. This is a new terrace by Ben Pentreath in Truro, in Cornwall, on the Duchy of Cornwall estates, which of course is connected with the king. And we've got this very splendid terrace which looks down over a valley, and as you're approaching Truro, you see this on a hill. It's a marvelous piece of work. It's only, well, fairly recently been completed. It's very civilized. It was finished in 2009. And the same architect has produced this. This is a new small town in Inverness-shire, not far from Inverness itself. It's on the estates of the Earl of Murray. And Ben Pentreath has been responsible for the buildings, and Andros Gianni for the town plan. And we're looking at houses which are all developed from the vernacular village architecture of Scotland, which we find on estate villages, reinterpreted. And there's mixed use here, there's social housing, all sorts of different uses, and there's, as you can see, shops and so on, integrated within the scheme. And it works very well. Now, as I hinted earlier, the tabula rasa, the empty table, demanded by modernists, really did jettison a huge language with all its possibilities. And it did so in favor of fancy wordplay, empty jargon, meaningless sound bites, and sloganizing cacophony accompanying a kind of bogus linguistic dance. It has been and is promoted by self-serving, self-regarding totalitarians who are interested only in power and money. It's ingested by a terrified, bemused, bovine public which has been bashed and bullied into accepting it. And because of the fancy language used, it doesn't know how to protest. So this gathering is very encouraging to see that the new generation is actually questioning some of the beliefs of this fundamentalist, quasi-religious sect. And one of the problems, of course, if you've got a visually illiterate and bullied public, and indeed modernist architects capable of only looking with their ears, and people who confuse obfuscation for profundity, cults, remember, invent their own languages, their own liturgies, and the more obscure and dark, the better they serve those who are their protagonists. Once in the cubicle of a university lavatory, I saw some graffiti, which I think summed it all up. The text read, "I have just had a modern movement." At least somebody in that dark satanic mill was perceptive enough to make that observation. And it's significant that a mind as receptive as that of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, according to Johann Peter Eckermann, could describe classicism as health, but much else as disease. I think it would be very interesting if he'd be able to comment on matters today. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, James.